Interesting to note on this one is this little blue dotted line at the bottom. This is split by types of school, and that little blue line at the bottom is the independent school line. And there's a number of charts that you'll see that the independent sector has stayed resolutely pretty much exactly the same size all the way through the history that I've looked at, and indeed all the growth in achievement and participation in education and higher education has come from the maintained sector. This one just looks at it as a participation rate, because I think it is important to note that population changes do have an effect on the numbers. So that just smooths it out a wee bit, but level 3 participation up from about 25% in 1985. 85 doesn't seem that long ago, does it? To over 60% today. Now, of course, in higher education, the real currency still, the predominant currency for progression to higher education is, of course, still A-levels. And this chart, which looks at the percentage of young accepts to the different mission groups, the different types of universities, the percentage of their acceptances who have A-levels and no A-levels. And actually the average for young people going on to higher education is still over 70% have A-levels. But you'll see that in the very selective areas, the Russell group there over 90%, the 94 group over 90%. So that's quite an interesting graph. But if we look at participation in A-levels, and again by school type, the bit that I found interesting on this was this funny little sort of bump in the middle, which is the yellow line is FE and tertiary and specialist colleges. So for a period from about 93 to the early 2000s, FE seemed to be growing its participation in A-levels, and then that seems to have bottomed out a bit, and obviously wasn't replaced by other providers of A-levels. Again, you see the blue line there, the independent line, pretty much staying at the same level all the way through. Now this one I thought was really interesting, that when you look at the percentage qualified to at least level 3, you'll see that this goes from 2001 to 2000. So in a 10-year period, it's gone up by 10 percentage points. That's a huge growth. It's, you know, it's about a 25% growth, in fact. But the bit I thought was interesting here was that the growth has actually come from academic qualifications, because in my mind there's been this burgeoning of participation, particularly at level 2 in BTECs and more vocational and applied type qualifications. But actually it seems that the growth in level 3 has come from academic qualifications. You'll forgive me if I just take a little detour to talk again about the difference between boys and girls, because this does have some importance later on. So just very quickly, I'm looking at gender gaps through key stages 1, 2 and 3. So girls are doing better than boys right across the 3 key stages. In reading and writing and literacy, you'll see that the gaps range in the sort of 7 to 13 percentage points. But actually in maths and science, slightly less of a gap, but girls still doing significantly better than boys. If we shift forward to key stages 4 and 5, you'll see that girls are doing 8 percentage points better for the the iconic 5 GCSEs, including English and mathematics, and that's quite a big difference. But actually, when you go up the scale to 2 A-level passes, it's a much smaller gap. And actually, if you look at the very highest achievement, 3 grade A's at A-level, the boys are, I think they're just pipping the girls by 0.1%. In fact, that should have been a minus on that chart, I've suddenly realised. So quite an interesting picture there of girls doing much better than boys, but then boys beginning to catch up later on. So just to summarise what we've discovered about secondary education over this period. So participation and achievement in secondary education has exploded over the last 50 years or so. And to kind of put it into context, more young people progress on to higher education today than took 5 GCSEs in 1995, and that really isn't very long ago at all. And I think that's quite extraordinary that over that 25-year period there's been a shift up in achievement of 2 whole levels. But I do think that there is this significant gap is very worrying between boys and girls. It doesn't seem to get on the political radar very much, and I think perhaps also needs addressing in terms of widening participation by young men in higher education. I'll come on to that in a bit. And just before I go on to talk more about the higher education spectrum on all of this, I couldn't resist just putting this extraordinary chart in, that having seen the girls doing so well, this is NEETs, this is 16 to 24-year-old NEETs, and what you see is the number of female NEETs, that's not in employment, education or training, is higher than boys all the way through. And I haven't even tried to start explaining or researching that anomaly. That's sort of slightly outside of my subject area, but an interesting point, and again very worrying. So back to admissions. So here's our 50-year picture. So let me put a little bit more context about what was going on in 1962 when UCA, again there'll be 1 or 2 of you in the room who applied to university on an UCA form. It wasn't until the early 90s that UCA merged with the Polytechnic admissions service called PCAS. It didn't end up being called PUCAS, it ended up being called UCAS. Probably quite a good thing. So back here in the early 60s, there were just 31 universities. And those universities would largely be taking their intake from independent and grammar schools. They would have been dominated by white males, I think probably about 3/4 male to 1/4 female. In fact, many of them actually had quotas for female intake. I have a girlfriend who's a very eminent oncologist who got an offer from Birmingham to do medicine, and she was offered 3 Bs and all her male colleagues were offered 3 Cs. So one of the ways that if it wasn't through quotas, they were limiting female intake by giving them a higher hurdle. And that seems completely alien to everyone in this room, I'm quite sure. And the participation rate in higher education was just 4%. Tiny, absolutely tiny. So here we are 50 years later, and the higher education picture looks incredibly much more diverse as well as very much larger. So we have people from a very, very wide range of different backgrounds and socio-economic backgrounds, different ethnicity, different qualifications. Actually, if we look across the whole UCAS system, only about 50% have A levels, because of course we've got a lot of international applicants and mature applicants who might have different qualifications. And of course, we have an intake from a wide range of domiciles, so international, EU, as well as from all around the UK, and we're up to, I think we're up to about 43% participation, so a 10-fold increase over 50 years. So it's quite interesting to look at what those 31 universities were in 1962, and some of the names on here will be quite familiar to you because it's pretty much the Russell Group. What I thought was quite interesting about the names on this list is that after the line that talks about older civics, they then talk about the younger civics. And in fact, my father, who was indeed a white male who got into Cambridge, I've no doubt, on 2 E-grade A-level passes, which was all you needed in those days, and he was from an appropriately posh school. He used to sneer at the younger civics, which were called red bricks. I'm sure some of you will remember that. And of course, the next raft of universities that came shortly in the early 60s, places like York, Warwick, Keele, were known as the plate glass